Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for session 7 of this European Security Summit, where we're looking at AI for security, leveraging the benefits and mitigating the risks. So today we're going to consider the interaction between AI and security, what benefits that might bring and the challenges of using AI, some of the risks that we might face. And we're going to explore how we can work together to ensure that AI systems are and remain both secure and trustworthy. We've got a very distinguished panel here today. So we've got 5 members. We'll start off with Susanna Hahn, who's a member of the European Parliament. We've then got Edward Christie joining us. So Edward works in NATO in the Emerging Security Challenges Division as the Deputy Head of the Innovation Unit. Then we've got Susanna Janssen. So Susana works in the European Commission in DG Home, so that's the DG for Migration and Home Affairs, where she's the head of the sector for migration. Then next we've got Johannes Hahn, who is also part of the European Commission, but is in DG Connect, so focused on communications, networks, content and technology, and he's a cybersecurity policy officer there. And last but not least, we've got Mark Smitham. So Mark works for Huwei and he is the head of EU Public Affairs. So welcome to all of the panel. Thank you for joining me. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Susanna Hahn.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation for coming to your digital event today. I'm actually very happy to have the opportunity to discuss the question of artificial intelligence in security with so many experts from so many different fields today, because I believe the exchange between legislators, science, and practical experience is very crucial if we as lawmakers want to develop the best possible legal framework. This only can work out if we work on this together. So before going into the discussion later, I would like to quickly introduce you to our current work on AI in the European Parliament. In a broader perspective and on security matters, of course, in particular. Following the publication of the Commission's white paper on artificial intelligence in February, I became responsible for all AI files for my group, Renew Europe, in the Committee of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection. We discussed and negotiated several aspects on AI, and now we have in the Parliament a special committee on artificial intelligence, and on behalf of my group, I'm the coordinator. Files that we discussed so far are, for example, civil liability regime and artificial intelligence, AI and education culture, ethical standards for AI in criminal law and law enforcement, AI in international law. So a very broad range that's already been discussed in the Parliament. And actually, these initiatives by the Parliament are voted these days, these weeks. And especially the report on the ethical framework of AI is also of interest for our topic today. So if we look into the question of AI and security, it's of course a very sensitive aspect, which has an international dimension, concerns security within the EU and on our external borders. And on most of these aspects, we're still at the beginning of the discussion, to be quite honest. For example, when it comes to AI in defense, that contains the question of autonomous weapon system, but it goes also far beyond that. So AI has the potential to improve European cyber defense capabilities, providing greater resilience and robustness in our ICT systems. However, AI can inevitably also contribute to cyber attacks. I mean, I'm not telling you something new here. And therefore, we as a Parliament asked the Commission to assess the benefits as well as security risk of applications of AI in cybersecurity, and especially evaluate the need for better prevention and mitigation measures. So apart from the question of defense, this is also a question of our citizens and our economy's security, as more data are stored and processed on clouds, mostly outside of the EU. So I'm very curious, especially to hear from our expert on this panel today, on the aspect of technical challenges they see in this, and which concrete measures they would propose in this regard. and especially keeping in mind that the Commission has already launched the European Cloud Strategy and several initiatives have followed. And overall, we have quite new European legislation on cybersecurity in place to support the member states in this, namely the Cybersecurity Act from 2019 and the Security of Network and Information Systems Directive from 2016. So right now we're looking at the outcome of the review of the NIS directive. And for me, it's important to highlight that the cooperation between member states and the coordination on European level are key to a strong European cybersecurity. We need common standards on a high level, and having our legislative framework in mind, the question for me as a lawmaker is not primarily about new special legislation for cybersecurity, but how can we look at this? Because as in other fields that we're dealing with, we already have legislation in place that must be implemented, and we have to look closely where are possible loopholes that should be closed. So for me, the question in our discussion today is, of course, apart from technical aspects, is about understanding how we want to use AI, in which general framework our guidelines should be. As we are still at the beginning of the discussion on AI and security, so I'm going to give you a short overview as well of my group's priorities and positions on AI that also can be applied to defense and fight cybersecurity. So for us as lawmakers, we're feeling a bit like we're doing a bit of pioneer work trying to find legislation for that. And of course, we have very different approaches in the parliament. I believe that we must pay attention not to overregulate AI developers and businesses, because we want to foster actually innovation and should really avoid hampering it. We need to make the EU legal framework fit for the digital age and make sure that AI with its specific characteristics is covered. And I think it's very important that we must avoid red tape, and we need to ensure legal certainty for businesses, for investors, for consumers. So I in general share the Commission's goal to put the EU on the forefront of AI development in the world. But for me, as a German liberal, data protection and fundamental freedoms are also of utmost importance when it comes to AI. For instance, I could never support the use of AI application for mass surveillance. As we're talking about security, it might be of interest for you as well that I'm very critical of facial recognition technologies in public spaces. The same applies to social scoring systems as currently implemented in China, for example. So democratic and fundamental rights must not in any case be threatened through use of AI. So the use of AI technologies by public authorities, for instance, for law enforcement, must be treated with utmost care and highly standards of data protection. And moreover, I think we need to make sure that algorithms don't deepen inequalities and discrimination which already exist. So we need to make sure we have unbiased data sets and high quality training data as well for AI. So in my opinion, we all have to keep those principles in mind when talking about AI in defense, security, and law enforcement. So I hope I could give you a quick overview of what we're doing in the Parliament and my political positions towards AI. And I'm very much looking forward to hear from the other panelists and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Svenja. Very interesting insight into the European Parliament's thinking and where they're going with AI. So next up, we have got Edward Christie from NATO. Over to you, Edward.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to our host for this kind invitation. My remarks will cover 5 main themes to frame NATO's approach to artificial intelligence. I'll start with a very brief strategic picture, then I'll give a few examples of AI for military applications, then I'll describe our approach for AI policy development at NATO, and under that heading, I'll talk about both adoption challenges and about the notion of responsible use. So in terms of the strategic context, what we have, of course, is a situation of great power competition. We all realize that the world is quite different from what we knew in the 1990s and early 2000s. We witness great power rivalries in both the economic and strategic spheres. And it is in this competitive strategic environment that we are simultaneously experiencing significant economic and societal disruptions, yielding both new opportunities and new risks and threats from the maturation of certain technologies, in particular artificial intelligence. With artificial intelligence, actual and potential military use cases cover a wide range already. Just as we see the development of self-driving cars in the civilian sector, there are experimental capabilities in terms of self-driving military supply vehicles. In the area of maintenance of equipment or vehicles, again, very similar to what we see emerging in the civilian sector, one can leverage AI and big data analytics for the purpose of predictive maintenance. In terms of intelligence analysis, there are AI solutions for the analysis of imagery and the detection of specific types of objects within analyzed imagery. We also see the emergence of new control software for unmanned aerial vehicles that are based on the notion of distributed autonomy. The idea here is that you have a control software on board one unmanned system that can manage other unmanned systems as well, but those other unmanned systems retain the ability to act with some degree of autonomy should the fleet or its communications be compromised. In terms of AI policy at NATO, I've had the privilege to be the lead author of our own white paper on artificial intelligence. In that context, the overarching idea is to work on two pillars, namely dynamic adoption and responsible use. Dynamic adoption, because adopting AI is going to require significant and transformative efforts on the part of defense establishments. Responsible use, because there is a need to frame our efforts in a manner that is consistent with the legal commitments and political values of allied governments. Regarding adoption challenges, there is of course a need for targeted state investments to make sure that allied governments can secure the right inputs. This is about having the right human talent, the right ICT infrastructure, and the right data sets, since machine learning requires data to be trained. But there are deeper challenges, including institutional and cultural ones. In short, developing AI applications requires what's called agile development, as opposed to waterfall development. In a nutshell, the agile approach, which comes from the software industry, is based on repeated, rapid, dynamic, highly iterative production processes that allow for multiple revisions and upgrades, just like with civilian sector software development. Developing AI requires similar flexibility, with the added challenge of managing the whole life cycle for the data needs: collection, storage, documentation, and exploitation. This adoption pillar is also about securing new financial investments and fostering innovation ecosystems involving industry, academia, and state institutions. In short, it's about making sure that we leverage the best available talent that is out there. The two pillars I outlined, dynamic adoption and responsible use, should be seen as complementary and synergistic rather than in opposition. For the adoption of technologies to succeed, there's a need for sound engineering principles. Obviously, we want systems that are reliable and understandable, and machine learning and deep learning can pose specific challenges in that area. And at the same time, we want to pursue AI in a manner that is consistent with our value commitments and with international law and international humanitarian law. So the desirable way forward is to find ways to ensure that technical standards and principles of engineering good practice are well aligned with legal obligations and political commitments. At NATO, we have yet to develop and adopt a set of common principles that all allies would agree to, but the intention is that we would seek to do so in the course of 2021. Some allies have made national commitments already. Another track is what allied governments have agreed to in the context of the United Nations group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems. That work led to 11 guiding principles which are well known. How exactly these ingredients will be used and what shape a possible future NATO view on responsible use of AI might take, that still needs to be developed. Subjectively, from my staff perspective, my personal prediction is that we will have more to say on principles of responsible use of AI in the course of next year. And with that, I yield back the floor. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Edward. An interesting insight there from NATO. So next up, we have Susanna Felkar-Janssen from the European Commission. Susanna, over to you.
Good morning to everybody. Mr. Chairman, distinguished audience, I'm very glad to be part of this panel and to be part of this very important conversation, actually, and to present the insights of DG Home Affairs and Security in relation to AI, and to present our activities. Our activities and the thinking about the use of AI is going back to already to 2018, when the Commission adopted in December the coordinated action plan, which already raised basically the need to leverage the benefit of AI for the security authorities for the maximum extent, but also to protect societies from the malicious use of AI, and also to equip law enforcement authorities to be able to trace, to detect and prosecute the use of AI by malicious actors. My commissioner, Ms. Johansson, made an extremely important keynote speech this morning, where one of the basic message was that we cannot afford having law enforcement lagging behind the criminal actors. If we look at cyber investigation, for example, in child sexual abuse or also in terrorist cases, police has to deal with hundreds of terabytes of data, and they have to be able to analyze this data and to find the linking points. So an average investigation on child sexual abuse materials includes 10,000 pictures that investigator has to look through and classify. Basically, the investigators and the police forces, they don't have the capacity to deal with this amount of information just on a purely human intervention, but they heavily have to rely on technologies. It's extremely funny, actually, to draw parallels with the great intelligent Sherlock Holmes, how investigations were carried out in the 19th centuries, purely based on logic, because there was no forensic. At that time, they couldn't even distinguish dried blood from mud strains. Already a detective with that intelligence, like Sherlock Holmes, would be lost completely in this present world because of the amount of information. Since there is no crime, doesn't matter if it's in online environment or offline physical environment, there is no crime today without any digital footprint. And basically, we have to be ready with the law enforcement authorities to carry out a digital transformation and to be able to cope with this, also to ensure the high security within the Schengen area and within the EU. It is very important. So the question is not if law enforcement and security authorities can use AI, but we have to see how they can use AI and what are the limits. Even this extremely interesting and valuable report of the European Parliament, which will be voted next week on the ethical aspects of the AI, recognizes that over 80% of AI applications used by police authorities don't raise any concern. So actually, we also only have to concentrate on that portion which potentially raise the concern, and we have to explain also to the authorities and also to the public how that works. It is also very important to emphasize that we are acting in a European context. There is flagship legislation and framework in place concerning data protection, the GDPR, which is a flagship initiative in the world, and it inspired actually data protection legislation throughout the world. And we have also an equivalent in the police context, which is the Police Data Protection Directive, which is transposed in the member states. We have also the Charter of Fundamental Rights with a very extensive jurisprudence of the Court of Justice. And of course, we have the Convention, the European Convention of Human Rights, also with a very extensive jurisprudence of the Strasbourg Court. And in addition to that, we have anti-discriminatory legislation. So that is the starting point, and that is the European environment. I also want to underline that AI applications are already experimented, piloted, and in use at least in 12 member states. We know about 24 use cases. and which were developed, and they are certain stage of development, which don't raise potential concerns. I think a key point that also Ms. Johansson mentioned, that is the trust, how to build trust with the public, how to communicate and create transparency for the authorities, how they are using these technologies, and also to allow public debate, of course, without jeopardizing the secrecy of the investigations, because that is the key element, not just for AI, but also how police forces are operating in Europe with the maximum openness towards society. So that would be my final message before we start the more detailed discussion, that we really have to see that law enforcement needs this technology, and we have to find the right balance between privacy and security and create the necessary framework. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Susanna. So next we have Dr. Johannes Hahn, who is from the European Commission as well, from the Directorate General of or DG Connect. So over to you, Johannes.
Thank you, Luke. So good morning to everybody, and many thanks for this kind invitation to be part in this very important panel. Although most of the information in regards to the European Commission and its initiatives on artificial intelligence has been already mentioned, I will quickly go through that as a general context of our activities, and then in some more detail. It was already mentioned, the white paper on artificial intelligence, which is the front runner to upcoming policy initiatives of this technology. The Commission has also recognized the strategic importance of AI in its coordinated plan on artificial intelligence, as was mentioned before, which aims to harmonize and coordinate AI initiatives across the EU, including, of course, its security-related aspects. At the same time, the new Security Union strategy, the European Commission has underlined the significance of AI by noting that it will bring both new benefits, but at the same time, new risks. So, and at the same time, when we go to cybersecurity, there is a lot of activity and several files, like the NIS directive and its upcoming review that was already mentioned, but also activities like the Cybersecurity Act, where we will have cybersecurity certification of systems, and we may have a dynamic certification where, again, technologies like artificial intelligence may play an important role, or the Commission recommendation on coordinated response to large-scale incident and crisis, where AI can be an important tool for protecting our critical infrastructures and systems. And of course, the Commission recommendation on the cybersecurity of 5G networks that follows a clear risk-based approach. So, very often when we talk about cybersecurity and artificial intelligence in public debates like this one, we tend to focus on the impact of artificial intelligence on security and on cybersecurity. These aspects, of course, is essential to understand the interplay between security and artificial intelligence. But the picture is incomplete if we miss the other direction, how we ensure the cybersecurity of artificial intelligence and relevant systems. For example, if we rely on artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to protect ourselves and respond to emerging threats and cyber attacks, how can we ensure that these algorithms are protected from any potential misuse or even interference? In the same direction, how we can ensure that artificial intelligence that is used to secure our systems, our home, to store our medical data, to do our online banking, is it secure enough to prevent all this data from ending up at the hands of cyber criminals? So in this context, we understand that it is essential to secure AI itself. So in particular, it is important to understand what needs to be secured. So what is the threat model that we need to develop and the adversarial model that are specific to the artificial intelligence and all the relevant technology. We need to understand the related data governance model, including the process of training algorithms for AI. We need to develop specific security measures to ensure that AI itself is secure. So the key message on my side is that artificial intelligence and security and cybersecurity have a multidimensional relationship, and there are a series of interdependencies. And I would like to highlight these three dimensions. First of all, the cybersecurity of AI systems. At the same time, and this is the initial and the most important one. Secondly, how AI can support cybersecurity, how we can use AI as tool and means to create smarter cybersecurity by developing more effective security controls and automated security controls at the same time. And third, the malicious use of AI, the adversarial use of AI. So how we can protect ourselves against the sophisticated types of attacks that can be AI powered. The above three dimensions are the starting point of the, let's say, the design and the architecture of the AI threat landscape in which the European Cybersecurity Agency, ENISA, and European Commission are currently working on. This work has been triggered by the white paper on artificial intelligence that I mentioned before, and soon the study will be released. I would like to conclude by saying that the cybersecurity of artificial intelligence systems and technologies today is an issue of strategic importance. So cybersecurity is not only about technology, it is an important element, of course, but it's not only about technology. It is first and foremost about security and the protection of the citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. Interesting and quite an interesting way of thinking about it with those three dimensions. I think they reflect some core themes that we've heard there. So, okay, last but by no means least, we've got a different perspective now from the private sector. So we have Mark Smitham, the head of EU Public Affairs for Huwei. Mark, over to you.
Morning, everyone. Thanks again to the organisers and also the other panelists for including the industry in this type of discussion. It's really valuable to have multi-stakeholder discussions about these very tough issues, particularly developments of AI. I really liked the panel that's been put together this morning, talking about the legislation, the military perspective, law enforcement perspective, and digital. And as Luke has just indicated, I'd like to give you an industry perspective of what it looks like to us. I'm going to reference a few of the things that everybody else has said already, but in particular, there are three things really to talk about. Two of them we've just heard about from Johannes, the security challenges of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a very sensitive technology, and therefore it rightly should be protected because it has quite a lot of capability. The other thing is the application of AI for security. Particularly security of information systems, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. But what is really interesting at the moment and very important from an industry perspective, going back to the point that was made slightly earlier, building trust in AI. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. What does transparency of AI services look like in order to build that kind of trustworthiness? So often when people see the Huawei logo, and they hear the name of the company, they usually think about 5G, among other things. It's not AI that comes to their mind first. However, in Europe, Huawei has announced an investment of over 100 million euros for the next 4 or 5 years in the European AI ecosystem to enable developers and small and medium enterprises to access AI services as well. We're quite heavily invested in this space. The other thing which is really important for us in order to explain to our customers and partners is the fact that we, as an industry player, deliver a full stack, all scenario system and strategy. So what does that mean? Quite a lot of people think about our mobile phone devices, and within those, some of them have AI capabilities. That means we need a chipset that works very well with it. Our lightweight Kunpeng processor is very good for that sort of thing. We also have a product available called Atlas, which is appropriate for AI training models. It's been optimized exactly for that type of storage and running over large volumes of data. But we also, within the stack of this technology, we have a framework called MindSpool, which enables developers to make the use of the resources that they have from hardware and software perspective. So that's what full stack means. But what do I mean when I say all scenarios? So it depends on the scale of the solutions. Some scenarios, like I've mentioned in your smartphone, needs a really lightweight, rapid response. So think about image optimization when a photograph is being taken. A profile photo might be optimized differently, and the AI needs to respond very quickly. Otherwise, you'll miss the moment for the photograph. Conversely, you might need something which is very low power consumption. That type of scenario is very different again from a rapid response on a telephone for a camera on a smartphone. For example, in Switzerland, where Huawei collaborates closely with a company called Agroscope and network operators in Switzerland to develop a smart agriculture application on drones. And the drones, of course, operate completely remotely. And the idea is that the farmers can get greater yield from their crops using the application of AI. So it's another scenario, which is again different from very large scenarios. And I'll come on to the point about the application of AI for security, talking about security information and event management systems and the application of insight security. If you need, we've already heard a good example where law enforcement needs to go over a large volume of data as part of criminal investigation. Well, security researchers need to do something very similar for network security and incident investigation as well. So you can automate these things, but that's a very large scenario, and Huawei plays in all of these spaces. We have a full stack, all scenario strategy when it comes to AI. So getting on to the point about security of artificial intelligence, it needs to be protected. You need to protect the source material and the data. We don't want it to be tampered with, especially during development. During operation of artificial intelligence, we need to make sure the service is constantly accessible. Connectivity is very important here, and that's a part which has actually played out in some of the white papers and reports that you've already heard mentioned. And most importantly, we want to, during the operation of artificial intelligence, we want to make sure that it's well protected to prevent algorithms from being stolen themselves, so that then they'll be deployed by potentially a malicious actor if they manage to obtain the algorithm, or the algorithm could be poisoned. So, for example, an autonomous vehicle is driving down the street and recognizes a stop sign and comes to a stop, when in actual fact there is no stop sign on the street. So the algorithm's input has been poisoned by false information. So there are different ways to architect an AI service to make sure it's well protected. We have a white paper about this. It is available, and I hope some of the participants on this event have been able to get hold of that. If not, please get in touch with me and we'll be able to provide it to you. So that's what it's like when, from an industry perspective, when it comes to the security challenges of AI. Talking about the application of AI for security, one of the really important things to consider is how event management systems can be built on large amounts of data. Just to go into that a little bit more detail, it can often be dynamically and comprehensively deployed to identify and handle security risks. It would improve threat identification accuracy, simplify threat analysis processes, and accelerate threat response handling. So like I said, where you have a security researcher trying to defend the network. They have a lot of information, a lot of data points coming in, and they really need that kind of help to identify patterns of behavior and get to the threat as quickly as possible and respond to the incident so that it doesn't develop further. But now let's talk about things in a bit more detail for transparency and trustworthiness of artificial intelligence. Most artificial intelligence is considered to be incredibly complicated, black box systems that are very hard to understand and explain. There may well be counterfactuals that can be exploited within the decision-making process that could be better explained than the algorithm itself. For example, why did the service choose not to reach a conclusion, as opposed to, well, we got from A to G and F along the way. How did we get there? Not too sure, but we can see the counterfactuals of why the service chose not to go to K, L, and N and further in the series. Difficult example to explain, which is why we're doing a lot more research. We're actively exploring explainability of artificial intelligence through hidden activation functions that could be triggered during operation in order to give more visible information when an algorithm is moving. Statistical analysis methods, so probabilistically it's easier to demonstrate how the algorithm is working, and also through a type of research known as saliency detection. So why is this important? What's valuable about making artificial intelligence more transparent? Well, when artificial intelligence is explainable, we can effectively verify and check it. The explainability of artificial intelligence will ensure clearer, logical relationships between input data and intermediate data, which will build trustworthiness of the service. Now, you've already heard from the other speakers, building trust in AI for people is going to be very valuable for the purposes of public safety and law enforcement investigation. Openness of law enforcement will build that relationship with the population, and when they are using artificial intelligence. It goes beyond that. I'm also thinking about the consumer space. How can people be comfortable with the capabilities on their smartphone or with the services that are AI enabled without that kind of transparency and trustworthiness available? So I think on the panel, the type of message I'd really like to see to discuss is thinking about high-risk applications, how they should be regulated. There really does need to be a clear framework. One of the other speakers has mentioned certainty for industry, legal certainty. We really need that in order to drive the adoption, which can make Europe lead in artificial intelligence. And there are some very difficult topics worthwhile to discuss when it comes to high-risk services. Not just thinking about the fact that AI systems and services are highly integrated across the supply chain. So geographic origin of one particular company is not going to help you make a high-risk decision or not. But also high-risk considerations of facial recognition. I've given you the smartphone example. That will be very different to facial recognition inside public safety scenarios. For example, the application of facial recognition in public spaces. That's a very different scenario. And whatever regime or framework we come up with, I'd really like to hear a discussion on that. We can go into healthcare scenarios as well, where it's probably better to talk about decision-making capabilities as opposed to how they might be deployed to help a decision be made by a human. So to sum up, I think a really inclusive approach is necessary for a healthy and competitive market that can deliver sustainable economic growth and bring real benefits for people and society. It's very valuable to be involved from industry in a multi-stakeholder discussion on this. It's very difficult sometimes for policymakers to reach conclusions on technical challenges, and that's the reason why industry should be involved as soon as possible. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion and some questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and again, thank you to the rest of the panel for some very interesting points that you've raised. So we've got a first question in from David Kirby in the audience. So David notes that any new and emerging technology presents both risks and opportunities. But what in particular is uniquely challenging about AI when we talk about security? And I think each of you have referenced some of those challenges, but would you like to go into a little bit more depth on the unique challenges of AI within security? Who would like to respond to that?
Okay, one of the big things which another participant has already mentioned, actually, and I think it was Christian from NATO, the idea that AI is very, very dynamic. So one of the considerable challenges is that a decision-making process can be constantly learning. Now, whether that's through machine learning techniques or deep neural networks, it means the algorithm will change and will change rapidly. Under those circumstances, it can be incredibly difficult to certify this type of activity, which is very valuable when making risk decisions on how a system or service may perform. It plays into a discussion about liability as well. So one of the main challenges is that needs to be provided in a little better detail is how this type of feature of artificial intelligence can actually be approved for compliance purposes, so that you know that when a system is certified, it is actually secure, it hasn't dynamically changed, or where it has been changed, that is notified for relevant risk management.
Great, thanks, Mark. Susanna.
It is time also to demystify AI. I think there is a lot of mystification because it's a new technology and we have a little understanding how it works. And I think it's always, if something new emerges, then there are a lot of question marks all around it. We are using artificial intelligence as a buzzword, but we know that it actually covers a lot of different technologies and a lot of different applications. And especially when we are ready to regulate, then we really have to know exactly what we are regulating. So we have to speak about the objective, because in the AI is also with, like every technologies, that the same algorithms can be used for different purposes. The same algorithm can be used to detect tumors, for example, and then for facial recognition, actually. So we have to see what is the objective and what is actually the technology, what is behind it, whether it's natural language processing, video processing, deep learning technologies. And we have to see how the objective can be achieved. But we really have to clarify what we want to achieve. And another, of course, everyone perceives AI as a very data-intensive technology, so it needs a lot of data, and of course the data quality is a big question. And I think when we discussed with the member states and with our partners, that was the biggest challenge, how to have good quality, reliable, trusted data sets, which are also balanced. And for this, you need an extremely big expertise, a very specific expertise, where of course education in universities, they are already started. You need data scientists, but the question is how this knowledge can be channelized into public administrations. It's not very easy, since public administration, they have their own working processes, and they are relatively rigid structures. So the question is how we can ensure the collaboration of academia, industry, and the public sector, especially with law enforcement, which is a very much secretive environment in that sense, that they are dealing with them investigations. So it is only trusted, security cleared personnel can get access to the premises and can get access to the data. And I think it imposes a special challenges, but there are examples in member states that they could overcome actually these difficulties. And I think there are very good models to follow. And we just have to see that we have enough forum and discussion with member states that they can exchange their best practices and take back home to the good example developed in other member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. So Svenja, I believe your hand up was next, and then I'll come to Edward.
Well, if we think what makes it unique, I mean, I agree with Susanna. We have a lot of demystifying on AI. I think the biggest demystifying I've been doing the last weeks is to explain people that our Corona apps do not run with AI. But I think what is special about this is the aspect of dual use quality of a lot of artificial intelligence application, and especially when we're talking about security, it is very urgent and fundamental to talk about ethical use of AI. To what extent do we have to have a human oversight? What decisions can be taken by AI? What decisions should be always taken by human? What decision can be co-taken by AI? So that are the underlying questions we need to discuss, and especially the aspect of dual use when it comes to security. And we had examples from China in the last weeks that European AI technology has been delivered to Xinjiang region for surveillance technology that is used in a region where human rights are oppressed and people are in camps. So that is particularly the question: where do we draw the framework for ethical use?
Thanks, Svenja. Edward.
Yeah, I think my co-panelists have mentioned almost absolutely everything that one could say to that question. I'll just maybe underscore the point about certification that Mark mentioned. That's obviously incredibly important, because for every previous technology, that's all for both civilian and military applications, for that matter. Certification is an incredibly important process before putting a product on the market, or before putting it in the hands of service personnel. And obviously with AI, it's a much more challenging exercise due to the versatility, which is the whole advantage of AI, but it's also how it challenges certification processes. But I do want to make a positive note, sort of a segue on the question, which is that there's a general arc of technological progress, if you look at military technologies in particular, which is taking us towards greater precision, greater accuracy. And in essence, one can view AI as really focused on pattern recognition and prediction, ever better predictions made by machines. And so if you consider where we are now as compared to where we were, and I'm going to take the 1960s as a counterexample, the emerging technologies, the disruptive technologies of the 1960s were things like intercontinental ballistic missiles and hydrogen bombs. I mean, that's what the major powers were putting their money into. And it was a terrifying time in reality. What we have now in the 2020s, for all the grave concerns one may have about AI in military applications, for example, I think that if we regulate these technologies wisely, I think the positive opportunities are absolutely gigantic. Greater precision, greater accuracy means less indiscriminate action, less error, essentially, more precision, and more potentially even more fairness. Who knows? So I would like to underscore the positive opportunities of AI for security applications and for defense. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So unless there are any other points, we'll move on to the next question. So this is from Afonso Ferreira, who's a Director of Research at CNRS, and particularly addressed to Mark, but I will open it up after Mark's had a chance to respond. So Huawei is being banned from 5G developments around Europe. What measures are your company taking to avoid the same happening to your AI offerings?
Thanks very much. And hello to everybody watching online. Thanks, Afonso, for the question. First of all, I think I'd like to go back to the point that was made earlier about certification. It's not necessarily completely accurate in the question to say that there are decisions being taken universally. There are countries and network operators that are quite happy with our software, services, and products. We've been in Europe for 20 years. We've been a trusted partner in Europe. We're making massive investments in Europe, and we're committed to European values and being able to provide systems and services that can help Europe compete. And we're working quite closely with some companies in order to build a bridge for those European companies to gain greater access to the Chinese market as well. So Huawei is one of the most Western focused companies, and quite a lot of the work that we do on security is valued and recognized. It just depends what motivation people have to try and make a decision. It's not always based on the facts. So the facts need to be verified. And talking about certification, thinking about AI, there is an industry scheme for 5G on equipment assurance. It's called NESAS. And some of the principles within that framework could be equally applied to AI in order to better demonstrate the security of an AI product and service. So we're already looking into that. And one of the other things that I'd like to emphasize is a discussion on 5G and telecommunication is significantly different to a discussion on artificial intelligence. The example I gave you as a full stack, all scenario solution. The idea is they're products. We don't actually deploy AI services. We provide them to European customers in Europe for them to work on by themselves after the point of sale. So talking about security risk management in a live public telecommunications system and network is very different to talking about AI products and services.
Thanks, Mark. Does anybody else want to respond or add to what Mark has said? If not, okay, let's move on to the next question. So this comes from Ruth Harris, who works at RAND Europe, and she's interested in the panel's views on how the reliance on AI agents increases the risk of diminished resilience, both in terms of de-skilling the workforce and in terms of overly trusting or at least insufficiently critiquing the view of the agents. Who would like to come in on that? Yes, Edward.
Just a few thoughts. I'm sure everybody on the panel has some thoughts on this, but I mean, de-skilling is the worst case scenario. I would rather think in terms of reskilling, that there is this notion that what humans are really especially good at is judgment and sort of more overarching sort of reasoning. There is a line about AI essentially freeing humans from mental drudgery. So essentially in the 19th century, we had new machinery that freed us from physical drudgery, from physical hard labor. AI can be used to free us from mental hard labor. And there's many examples in effect with AI where you can have effective, what we call in the military sphere, human-machine teaming, but I mean, it exists in the civilian sector as well. So essentially, you can use AI algorithms to pre-select or pre-filter masses of information, but you still leave the more subtle human judgment up to humans. So in effect, it could actually free up brain power rather than displace it. So I'd rather talk of reskilling and probably also a little bit of upskilling rather than de-skilling. As for trust, I mean, that's a very good point. Obviously, that's a huge area of work. Again, I mean, certainly the academics we work with talk very much on this topic of human-machine teaming. And that's quite a complex area. It is a risk we need to be aware of. I'll leave it at that. Over.
Thanks, Edward. Anybody else would like to comment on this? No?
Yes.
Oh, yes, Susanna.
No, I just wanted to completely concur what Edward was saying. I really think that AI is freeing up a lot of labor force. It is not just that freeing them up to do automated and boring work, but it will capacitate them to do much more interesting work and to do more analysis. So I think it will be indeed a reskilling of working force. I have never seen AI as diminishing resilience or diminishing trust. it is something new. You have to really educate people. Also, you have to educate the own workforces, and you have to have experts and universities. So the skill aspect is extremely important. And then, of course, what is also important, that to have controlled processes of AI application throughout the life cycle of this application from the beginning, to know what is going in and how this is selected and how the data is cleansed, and then always to have a monitoring process over the results. And I also would like to say that AI is not taking decision, because there are a lot of people and scholars who are representing that view that AI is taking decisions. No, the decisions are always taken by humans. The AI is only assisting humans to take those decisions by pre-selections, by scrolling or establishing an order of information, or to establish links and patterns of information which would be otherwise undetected. So I think it is very important that the human oversight is always there. We are not talking about AI super intelligence. It exists only in Hollywood. What we are talking about is the so-called weak or narrow AI, which are essentially assistance systems, and they are assisting humans to take the right decisions. Humans are equally biased. If the data sets are not carefully selected, this bias will be reinforced by the AI systems. So there must be a process which balances this potential bias. But it is also possible that the system will promote more fairness and more balanced decision than what would be maybe taken by humans without the system. Thank you.
Thank you. Svenja.
From politicians' side of view, when we talk about workforce skills, for me it's especially about like lifelong learning. I mean, I was born in 1989, and before coming to the parliament, I've been working as a social media officer. And I bet when I was born, my parents were not imagining that this is the job I would maybe take on in the future. It's just normal. We've seen so many changes in our workforce in the last centuries. There's always been changes. So for me as a politician, it's a matter of how we structure these changes and how we break it through and break it down and help people adapt to those changes. I mean, we of course have to raise question, are there maybe jobs we should maybe no longer skill people in, because we know they might gonna be disappear. We need to be honest with them. What job can they take on in the future? But we as well need to make it available to learn this, to train this, and that is, for example, amongst others, in the budget negotiations, for example, right now, where we say we need to heavily invest into innovation, research, education, especially, so people have a platform of getting new skills, of adapting to this, and we should really embrace career changes, that it's really, really no longer you pick one job and you stay in that job. My dad, when he learned to work in an expert company when he was 16. He worked until he retired this year in an expert company. And most of his career, he worked over 20 years in the same company. And this is something that most likely is not going to be the given standards. And we need to really embrace, and especially me coming from Germany, we have a culture where you need to have a degree or a certificate on everything. And we need to embrace that education can have many different phases, that it's okay to reskill, to upskill, to change profession. And we especially need to create a new educational mindset, in my opinion. That is this one part as well. And then we need to see, of course, some jobs will disappear, but many other jobs will appear. And therefore, it's important as well to have programs on helping people to adapt.
Thanks, Svenja. Yeah, important to remember the positive of all of this. So, Mark.
So I'm smiling and nodding along to a lot of these remarks because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's EU Code Week this week, and it's very important. And Ada Lovelace Day was on Tuesday. It's very important to emphasise the need for, exactly as you say, constant lifelong learning, but also trying to give the skills that younger people need as well. Huawei's committed to this type of thing. We have a Seeds for the Future program to try and invest and help people gain more skills in digital industry. That's mainly geared towards university students. We also have a scheme of smart buses, which goes to schools to give them greater access, give the school children greater access to technologies. This is operated in the Benelux region and also in Spain and Portugal as well. And we are hoping, if measures allow, to try and roll that type of thing out. It can be very difficult under the current environment. But one of the ones which is really valuable and I feel quite proud of is the work that we've done for skills development and access to digital resources in Bangladesh for women. It's quite often culturally the case that they do not have access to travel to urban centres where this technology exists, and so we have facilities that actually goes out to them and provides them with access. At the moment, it's for reading purposes and things like that. And it really is important to give them the access to the facilities that they require to upskill right from the very ground. And that's a principle within the company that goes all the way through to AI and its application as well.
Thanks, Mark. So let's move on there. It looks like we've no more comments on that. So another question from Afonso Ferreira, one that's quite close to my heart as somebody who works in security and defence. So since the Snowden revelations, which he notes was back in 2013, we know that AI is widely deployed in mass surveillance systems by the US and probably a number of other countries. So the question is, how can we reconcile national security objectives with the AI-based economic progress? Who would like to respond to that? Yes, please, Edward.
I would say, well, I mean, I'm not going to address the Snowden controversy, obviously. But I think, first of all, we have to reconcile national security objectives and AI-based economic progress. So there's not a choice. We have to align the policies. The short answer would be we need good governance. We need a number of principles on a responsible state behavior. That's a little bit more for the defense side of things. But a word, nevertheless, on surveillance per se. It is easy to look at questions like that purely from the perspective of the citizen of a rich country with limited awareness of the rest of the world. And I'm not claiming that people have limited awareness necessarily, but because I work in defense, I think it's important to realize we live in a competitive world in which there are security threats. And so certain measures are necessary. States do have to take certain measures. Intelligence services have to take certain measures. Defense forces have to take certain measures to ensure the security and defense of their populations. And so a number of these activities are necessary, but of course they have to be governed responsibly. And of course, mass surveillance of one's domestic population, that's not exactly a vote winner, and I'm not defending that. But there is a need for intelligence and counterintelligence activities in our day and age. So we need to have a balanced approach, which takes into consideration the national security interests and the duties that we have to protect our populations in both directions, if you will. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Edward. Anybody else got any thoughts? Yes, Susanna.
Thank you very much. I really would like to emphasize what I also said in my presentation, that we really have to look at the legal environment we are acting in, because we have very clear legislation already now and very strong legislation, and we have the right authorities. So all of the structures within the member states actually to control the public authorities and also private parties, I have to emphasize, how they are investigating and what kind of devices and tools they are using, for example. And that's why I don't really like this comparison with the US, where there are no federal laws, for example, on mass surveillance and facial recognition, and it remains only in the states or even within the cities. We have a very strong data protection framework, and basically all of the processing of biometric data is subject to a prior authorization of the data protection authorities and also a fundamental right impact assessment. That is the precondition to carry out already now. So I think that is important to remember. The other point what we have to make is to conduct a very differentiated debate and to understand how this technology is used and clearly distinguish between private entities and the public entities. And then the question is, what is the justification that private entities can use this technology? And I very much appreciated actually the report of the European Parliament on the ethical use of AI, which laid down a framework for public authorities how to use surveillance technologies, which has to be very clearly defined. The duration must be limited. The use cases must be very clearly framed. And also this report wouldn't allow these technologies for private parties. This is not the official opinion, of course, of the European Commission, but I really think that this is a position very much worth to think of. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna. Svenja, I think you had a point as well.
Well, hard no from me on the use of AI applications in mass surveillance. That is really, really not compatible with our fundamental basic rights, with our basic citizens' rights in the EU. We know that US as well using EU citizens' data for all of this, as we are know. The court for now stopped the privacy shield because it is in fact not a privacy shield. So with the relation with the US, there's a lot of negotiation that needs to be ongoing on this. And for the EU, as Susanna already said, the Parliament is positioning itself with the aspect of ethics and AI, and this is a very, very fundamental question. And I do not think we should undermine our citizens' rights here.
Thank you, Svenja. Anybody else got any follow-up to that? If not, we'll move on to the next question. So this has come from Bjorn Bonsdorf, the Swedish People's Party of Finland, and he's a political advisor there. So he's specifically asking this question to Edward. What kind of legislation would you like to see in terms of automated weapon systems? And I'll open this up, but we'll go to Edward first.
Thanks very much for the question. The first thing to know is that we're not operating in a vacuum. So there's already a major important body of international law and international humanitarian law, which governs what states are allowed to do in situations of conflict. Principles such as distinction and proportionality. These are discussions that are maybe not often heard in EU circles per se, or not in the traditional typical ones, let's say. But these are typically discussions that happen under UN auspices, for example. And so for those who followed the work of the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems in Geneva, there was a reaffirmation late last year of by all state parties pretty much on international law and international humanitarian law principles. And the idea is that however these systems are developed, there should always be clear accountability. There should always be respect for the principles of distinction and proportionality. In other words, you're not allowed. It's not because you have a new technology that all of a sudden the existing rules that say that you're not allowed to target civilians or that you can use force indiscriminately. I mean, these rules stay in force, and that's been the position of many state parties. So then the question is, do we need legislation at the national level or at the EU level on these issues? That's debatable. It may not quite function that way. The trend currently is rather for states to make commitments and to stick to those commitments, and they are responsible under international law and international humanitarian law for respecting those commitments. There are processes. One in particular is so-called Article 36 under the, I think, second additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, where states are responsible for making reviews of any new weapon system or technology to ensure that it will comply with international humanitarian law. So that's roughly how that sort of work functions. If one desires to have more constraining agreements, then that would take us into the whole field of arms control, and those are basically international agreements between states, where states agree to self-limit their behavior. There are examples to do with missile technologies, with nuclear weapons. There are conventions on biological weapons, on chemical weapons. There's a lot of precedent there. Some states have promoted that sort of approach. Other states are more cautious and they want to wait and see. We have to understand, of course, that in this whole debate, we're looking at major powers that do not necessarily completely trust one another. Whether it's on the one hand the United States, on the other side China or the Russian Federation. And so if you look at the positions those major states have taken at the UN, for example, they have mainly stuck to saying we will comply with international law and international humanitarian law. The basic legal frameworks are already there, and we reaffirm those commitments, but not necessarily wanting to have a completely new and binding agreement.
Thanks, Edward. Would anybody else like to weigh in on that? Yes, Mark.
Thanks. So I just wanted to pick up on the proposal of whereabouts should some sort of policy or legislation be proposed, national, European, or something even more. One thing which has come up recently, we have been talking quite a lot on the panel about the value of data for AI services, their development, and also their operation, and the importance of security of that data. So combining that discussion with the point about where should this type of decision making be taken, there's been a new proposal for a global initiative on data security. It has some very good principles that overlap with the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, talking about infrastructure protection, non-proliferation and vulnerability notification, and lifecycle security to prevent backdoors and intentional security weaknesses. That type of approach, Paris Call, very global. This new global initiative on data security, I think, is valuable. The thing is, there are more policy proposals than they are legislative proposals. So not only should there be global, and I started the panel by saying there needs to be multi-stakeholder as well as multilateral approaches, but multi-stakeholder between governments, industry and civil society in order to reach a framework on AI that meets our values and protection of human rights. But also, how can that type of initiative and those frameworks be replicated into legislation for purposes of enforcement and compliance? That's an outstanding question. From the perspective of Huawei, we definitely agree with lots of the remarks that have already been made. We comply with international law and national law. Where that's wrong, the law needs to be changed. We fully support prevention of modern slavery and also the protection of fundamental human rights. We have not just made this as a small statement to make it clear that we are committed to them. We have some very clear, detailed statements about how the company feels about this available on our website. Those sorts of things should not be done and discussed by single companies. This needs to be done by industry with government hand in hand to make sure that AI frameworks will meet the needs of not just industry and the economy, but also will meet the needs of consumers in order to protect their fundamental rights and deliver services that are fit not only for the digital age in Europe, but also fit for EU values as well.
Thanks, Mark. Any follow-up to Mark's comment? Is there any sort of thoughts on the global initiative on data security and its relevance to AI? No. Okay, so we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to quickly go around now, and if anybody's got any closing comments, if you could keep them as brief as possible, that would be great. So we'll start with Svenja. Svenja, any final comments, closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was actually very interesting to hear from these different players, and I'm pretty sure the audience hopefully thinks so as well. I think it's really important that we keep in mind that artificial intelligence has much more opportunities than threats, and if we manage to have a smart framework regulation in the EU that really allows innovation to grow, then we can really have real bonus for the European Union to be leading actually in the digital area. So this is what I believe we should all be working for setting standards worldwide.
Thank you. Edward.
Thanks. Very strongly support what Svenja just said. I would like to add to that. Essentially, yes, I mean, absolutely, there are more opportunities than risks or threats. We need to get the governance right. But I would add one consideration. We shouldn't be too Eurocentric. Basically, I'm calling upon the other panelists not to be too Eurocentric, because there's a bigger world out there. Obviously, as a NATO official, I'm going to encourage all of you to work very closely with the United States and Canada, and Turkey for that matter, and Norway and the UK. But there's generally a broader world out there. And I think I'm a great believer in having a community of values. We do have common values across the Atlantic and with other nations such as Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and others. So let us not be too Eurocentric. Let us reach out. And I think we can get the governance right in the civilian sector and also in the military sector. And incidentally, we have a lot to learn from one another. The different communities should talk with each other more. Thank you.
Thanks, Edward. Susanna?
Yes, I think what is important is building bridges, because this dialogue also has shown that actually we don't have so many differences, and we agree in most of the things which was said either by Edward, also by Svenja, Mark. So there are really no differences, and I think the baseline is common for all of it. I also agree with the global approach. Actually, what I just wanted to say in principle, that to frame the European debate, we have to pay attention to the European legal environment, actually. But we are also starting now a big project with the United Nations, actually, to develop common tools for law enforcement globally, where we are also leading this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna. Johannes?
Yes, just quickly to say that artificial intelligence, similar to any other digital disruptive technology, is result and the product of research and innovation. Research and innovation coming from industry, coming from national funding, and coming from European funding. And in this direction, as far as the EU is concerned, EU has invested in innovation more than 1.5 billion euros the last 3 years on AI in particular. And this will continue, of course, and will intensify at EU level. We will continue to invest in research and development through the Digital Europe program, the Connective Europe Facility 2 program, and the Horizon Europe program. Just an example, for Horizon Europe program, the Commission proposed to invest 15 billion in the digital industry and space cluster, where AI is a key activity there. As part of the DEP, the Commission proposed to invest almost 2.5 billion in deploying data platforms and AI applications. Actually, as we speak today, we evaluate proposals on AI and security that also involve law enforcement. And not only on AI, but also in digital technologies around that. So here we have the example of the Cybersecurity Competence Center that will be investing the next years together with member states a lot of money on cybersecurity, where AI, of course, is going to be one technology that needs to be protected. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mark?
Thanks very much. It's been a really exciting panel. Some final remarks. Trustworthiness is something very important that I think really needs to be emphasized. Categorization of AI services according to risk. We've discussed they're very dynamic in nature, and the likes of a blanket decision of risk based on geographic origin will not take into account the dynamic nature and will not adequately address the global supply chain within which AI services are developed and they operate. I definitely agree with some of the other, with all the other panelists talking about the value and the importance of multilateral discussions. Europe, UK, Canada, we have security centres in both those countries in order to demonstrate to the authorities the value of our product. We have made progress in the security of that. We wouldn't be able to do that if it was a unilateral discussion. Multilateral discussions are important. And again, talking about multi-stakeholder approaches, including industry in these discussions is very, very important. Huawei is a good example of this. We are the only Chinese company which has actually signed the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. We have significant investments for the last 10 years in EU research projects, and that sort of investment and that sort of multi-stakeholder relationship really should continue on the basis of looking at the facts that can be verified, considering categorization of risk. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Okay, well, it just remains me to say, firstly, thank you to the audience for your participation and interesting questions. Thank you to the team at Forum Europe who've been working diligently behind the scenes to help us make this a fruitful panel. And finally, thank you to the panel. It's been a really interesting debate, as you've all noted, and we really appreciate your sort of openness and willingness to discuss this. So that concludes our session. So there's now an hour-long break, and at 1:30 you'll be coming back for session 8, which is on terrorism and radicalization in Europe. So thank you, everyone.